Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the Kootenai Conservation Program's Winter Webinar Series. This year, our series focuses on the theme, From Alpine to Valley Bottom, Conserving Essential Habitats in the Kootenays. My name is Marcy Marr, and I am KCP's Stewardship Coordinator, and will be the host for today's webinar. Nicole Trigg, KCP's Communications Coordinator, is also on board to ensure that our technology runs smoothly this morning. Given the rich heritage of stewardship in the Kootenai region, I would like to acknowledge that KCP's work occurs in the traditional territories of the Ktunaxa, Shuswap, Sinixt, and Syilx peoples, who have lived here and stewarded the land and water for many generations. While some people are still joining us, I'll talk a bit about the Kootenai Conservation Program, known as KCP. We're a broad partnership founded in 2002 and currently comprised of over 80 land and water conservation and stewardship groups, government agencies, resource industries, and agricultural producers working throughout the East and West Kootenays and Southeastern BC. KCP's mandate is to coordinate and facilitate conservation efforts on private land and to generate the support and resources needed to maintain this effort. We achieve this through increasing the effectiveness, collaboration, and coordination of private land securement and stewardship activities, building financial and technical capacity of our partner organizations, and serving as a network to achieve efficiencies, synergies, and ultimately greater effectiveness. So far, we have almost 120 people on this webinar, and we're always excited to know who's joined us. So please respond to these two questions in the chat box. Where are you based, and what is your affiliation? So we know who's on the webinar today. Thanks. Give you a couple minutes for that. Okay, so if you've just joined us, we're taking a moment to put in the chat box where you are based and what your affiliation is. Great, thanks everybody, thanks for sharing. So today is the second webinar in our four-part series. And I'm excited that we have such an excellent and interesting group of speakers this year. If you missed our webinar, Drones and Dens, that Doris Haas-Leitner, a Wolverine biologist, presented last week, you can find links to the recording on KCP's website, kootenaiconservation.ca. And before we get to our featured presenter, I'd like to tell you about upcoming webinars. On February 17th, we will feature Brian Churchill from the wild site Creston Valley branch, who will present how on the Creston Valley Green Map, how it was developed and is being used to increase local conservation awareness and opportunities in the Creston Valley. We'll wrap up our webinar series on February 25th with Ryan Durand of Ecologic Consultants, who will describe the Columbia Valley Wetland Mapping Project, combining digital technologies and wetland ecology. I'd like to quickly review some information about this webinar. It'll be approximately 40 minutes with up to 15 minutes for questions at the end. And Rachel said she could stay on a little longer if we have more questions. As an audience member, you're on mute for the presentation. If you're not familiar with the Zoom platform, take a moment to locate your control panel by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your screen. And if you have questions for Rachel about her presentation, please enter those questions in the Q&A option in your toolbar, and they'll be answered at the end of the presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties, click on the chat option, and that's where Nicole Trigg will help you sort out any issues that you might be having. So questions for Rachel in the Q&A and any technical issues in the chat option, please. This webinar will be recorded and will be made available on our website. And you'll also receive a follow-up email with the presenter's contact information, a link to the webinar recording, and a short post-webinar survey. And we hope you'll respond to the survey, please, because it helps us plan for next year's winter webinar series. And we're always grateful for the funders and supporters of KCP, without whom we could not do these kinds of programs. So now I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Rachel Holt is a PhD RP bioecologist trained in the science of conservation biology and land management, and spends her days working to apply science in the land and resource management context. Her areas of expertise include technical analysis of environmental conditions and trends, working with technical and negotiation teams to solve conservation challenges, and scientific development of management frameworks. Over the past 20 years, Rachel has been a member of multiple provincial government old growth working groups and cumulative effects teams. And she's also been both a member and vice chair of the BC Forest Practices Board. In today's presentation, a provincial and regional overview of BC's old growth forests, where are we at and what's happening now, Rachel will provide the context with a short history of old forest management in BC. She'll bring together the findings and recommendations from her latest report entitled BC Old Growth Forests, A Last Stand for Biodiversity, and those of the province's strategic old growth panel, which outlined the state of old forests in the province for the Minister of Forests. Rachel will conclude with identifying required next steps for old forest conservation regionally and provincially. So thank you, Rachel, for being a part of KCP's winter webinar series, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Marcy. Just share my screen. So thanks for joining me today. Anybody who knows me knows that I normally pace about and glare at people while I'm talking. I can't do that on here, and so I'm sorry if that's a missing feature. I am going to fly through this talk. So I will start. I couldn't decide whether this was a tragedy or a fairy tale. I didn't know which story I was telling you today. I couldn't decide where to focus. I could have focused on, I could give a long talk. I actually wrote about 6 different versions of this talk about the biodiversity of British Columbia, or I could talk about the social elements of managing for old forest, or I could talk about sustainability issues, or I could talk about mapping and issues with data, or provisional overviews of the state of the land base. Or I could talk about science. What concerns me, and I guess where I'm going to go with this, is that the trees are getting lost in all these conversations. So I'm going to try and focus on what are the issues, what are people saying needs to happen, and what is happening. So one slide of what could have been 100 old forest. Why is it important? It has all these values. I think you're on this call today, you know this. Old forests are at risk globally and locally because they're irreplaceable. And they're at risk because we log them and we don't intend to replace them. Old forests in the British Columbia context are also really important because they are the one thing that we manage to maintain all the rest of the biodiversity in British Columbia. They are the cost filter. And if our approach is failing, then the losses extend far beyond just old forest. I could have had a tangent here on carbon, but I decided not to. I decided instead to have a tangent. And if we had longer, I'd have a minute of silence. Because we're losing large species in this province, outside our back door, outside my back door, we're some of the richest people in the world, and we are, in quotes, winking out populations of things that require these forests. These are the ones we know about, and there are many that we don't know about. So almost 2 years ago now, the provincial government decided to restart a conversation on old forests. And they decided to set up an independent panel to look at the state of old forests. And that process spurred myself and two colleagues, Karen Price and Dave Daust, to write this report, BC's Old Growth Forests, A Last Stand for Biodiversity. We wrote this report because we were very concerned about the level of misinformation coming from all kinds of sources, but particularly not clarified by government about the state of British Columbia's forests. We also learned that there was no analytical support provided for the panel, and so we took it upon ourselves to do our own provincial analysis. We did it for free. I've spent a huge amount of time since then giving talks like this to follow up on that, but we did it because we felt people needed a much better understanding of the state of British Columbia. So I'm just going to fly through what that said. The province says there's 13.8 million hectares of old growth in the province, and their old growth map looks very much like this. And this is our old growth map too, the one that has all the potential forest on it. Site index SI here, site index greater than 5, means basically all the forested land base. If you break down though and start to look at a thing called site index greater than 10, that means sites that can grow trees that are 10 meters tall in 50 years. So they're a little more productive, those sites. The amount of green on the map reduces. And if I increase that site index cutoff, we get fewer old forests. And when I'm at site index greater than 20, at the scale of the province, you can hardly see any green on the map. That means that there aren't old growth forests of any extent on these sites. And looking at that through a risk lens, the current risk is highlighted on the left, and the future risk, if we run out policy, is highlighted on the right. That's the summary of the BC Last Stand report. Looking more specifically at ecosystems in the Kootenai region. So on this graphic here, we can see on the left, the proportion of old forest, the percent old forest, and along the bottom, biogeoclimatic groups. So in the middle there, the highlighted ones are the interior cedar hemlock drier types and the interior cedar hemlock wetter types. And the little bars, the flat bars on that graphic, tell you the approximated natural level of old forest in those units. And what we see on these graphs is that for some units, we are very far below the natural amount of old forest. So for instance, if you look at the CDF, the coastal Douglas fir, all of the coastal Douglas fir has very little old forest compared to the natural amount. In those middle units in the ICH zones, we have some variability. All of it is way below natural levels, but as we get into these higher productivity site index sites, we are way, way, way below the natural levels. And so the issue here is that the province, in its generic statements, is equating the forest on the left with the forest on the right. And from a biodiversity perspective, those things are, they're equally valuable, but they're very different and they're not the same. And the functions of the forest on the right are very different from the functions on the left. And the carbon storage on the right is very different than the carbon storage on the left. So it is extremely important that we don't pretend that they are the same thing. And just for the geeks in the crowd, I know you're there. The reason we use site index, this could also be another 2-hour talk, is that the site index in the VRI data, the inventory site index, correlates quite well. This is for old forests on the coasts only, So what it tells you is that if you have a low site index on the left-hand end of the horizontal axis, you have little forests. You have very low volume in your forests. And if you're on the right-hand end and you have a high site index out here, then you are in big structured forests. And this is why we had some sense that using that as the basis of our analysis reflected the values that we were interested in, because what we are losing are the big forests. In fact, what we have lost already are the big forests, and what we continue to lose are those forests, the forests with big trees. So back to the old growth strategic panel, Merkel and Gawley. They came out with 14 recommendations, and I'm just going to talk about 2 of them here. They said we should immediately defer at-risk old forest, and they also said that there needed to be a paradigm shift in how we are managing forests. So specifically, they said, until a new strategy is implemented, defer development in old forests where ecosystems are at very high and near-term risk of irreversible biodiversity loss. And then they listed what that would mean. They listed these points. They said where there's 10%, less than 10% old forest remaining in a unit, where there's ancient forest, for forests needed for resilience, and for those higher productivity forests with site index greater than 20. And they also said we need to fix how we do the targets. We need to use science, and we need to stop doing the math wrong. I hesitate with all these things because I could spend lots of time talking about every individual element of these points that I'm raising, and of course I don't have time to do that here. So I apologize if I fly over some of these things, but I did think I would take a moment to just remind people how we currently set targets for the amount of old forest we are supposedly setting aside. So in the calculations of how much old forest we're going to set aside, on the left here, the calculation assumes that every biogeoclimatic variant has 12% in protected areas. Of course, most of the, in quotes, productive ecosystems do not have 12% set aside in protected areas. The province is somewhere around 15% protected areas overall, 45% of which is alpine areas. And most of the low elevation valley ecosystems, the IDF, the CDF, the ICH, all of those valley bottoms have 1, 2, 3% protected areas, very low levels. So this first assumption is incorrect. And then the province split up the province of BC into low, intermediate, and high biodiversity areas and said, look, let's set a high target in the high biodiversity areas, and let's set a medium target in the intermediate areas, and let's set a low target in the low biodiversity areas. And then they distributed those over the land base. They called 45% of the land base low, 45% of the land base intermediate, and 10% of the land base high. So then you get a target for a particular biogeoclimatic variant. And then you put it on a scale relating to the full land base of that type. And in order to understand risk, you have to compare it to how much naturally old there would be. So for this particular biogeoclimatic you have an overall target of 10%-ish. It's actually 9 and something. But you have, remember here what we have 45% of the land base where your target is less than 4%. And then so comparing it to the biodiversity guidebook level of natural old, sorry, I just went the wrong way, gives us an indication of risk. I will point out that these biodiversity guidebook natural old are very incorrect from a science perspective. And there's, for most of the wet ecosystems in the province, that natural old level is significantly higher. But somewhere in between here, for individual ecosystems, you can compare your overall target to the natural amount expected, and then you get risk. That's how we do that. Just to remind us, so that is what is embodied in how we manage old forest right now. Just to remind those who were here 25 years ago doing this, you were supposed to do fine scale ecosystem representation. That never happened. You were supposed to manage for corridors, they call them forest ecosystem networks. That never happened. There was a thought that if we were going to set aside old growth, we would set aside some of the best remaining, but the guidance was explicitly to put your old growth in areas that don't affect timber. We have guidance, well, direction, it's not guidance, to do all of this without unduly reducing the timber supply from British Columbia's forests, and only if it's practicable to do so. And then we set timber caps that said, okay, you can do all of this stuff for biodiversity, but you can't affect the timber supply more than this amount. So our current system results in a high risk strategy. So how does this play out? Provincial ecologist Deb McKillop a couple of years ago looked at the status of OGMA's old growth management areas in the Kootenai region. And to cut yet another long story short, she looked at the data and showed that less than, so on the left we have data for the cell stage distribution in OGMA's in Arrow Forest District, and on the right the cell stage distribution in Kootenai Lake District. And the key point to take away here is that in blue is the old forest that is captured in the old growth management areas. So in both of these local districts outside my door here, less than 20% of the forest in old growth management areas is actually old. And 80% of the forest is not old. And in many cases, there is old outside old growth management areas. And this is an example of block that I can see outside my window, almost up on the hill there on Give Out. This is exceptionally rare old forest for this region, not in an old growth management area. This map shows you in red mapped old growth, and in yellow old growth management areas for the same site. K11, Give Out Creek. It's one of the areas immediately close to Nelson that actually has any old growth at all. It's designated as a low biodiversity emphasis option, so you actually don't have to meet your old forest requirements for 250 years. That means you can log old growth today and meet the target in 250 years. That's the notion of drawdown. So back in 2019, now the local West Kootenai Eco Society went to the district manager and said, we've been talking to you about this for years, you're not meeting the existing weak legal requirements, and we requested an immediate moratorium on harvest. The response was, no, I don't have the ability to do that. And it's not, I'll just cut to two of the points here. I don't have the ability to do that, and it's not illegal. I would still question that second point, but that is their response. Now it's 2021, harvesting goes on. So what does it really look like? So here we are in the Kootenays. I hope that's not too dark on your screens. We can see Kootenai Lake running north-south, Nelson in the little crook there at the end of the west arm. The purple shows mapped old forest. If you're familiar with this region, you can see already that it tends to be at high elevations, and it tends to be at the back of valleys if it's anywhere. Those are cut blocks. And the kind of pink shading is are large fires. this map shows you, so remember Gawley and Merkel said we should set aside forests that have less than 10% remaining old growth by Beck and by landscape unit Beck. This map in the dark base, all the area mapped here shown in color has less than 10% old forest remaining. The darkest colors, well, the light color are higher elevation areas where there's possibly an issue with the identification of old in the database. So in some areas, so a geeky comment here, in some areas it's tagged as age class 8 when it should be 9. So that needs a little bit more of a careful look, but all the mapped areas here have less than 10% old forest. There is the old forest. So just to summarize it by region, so what we have here on the x-axis is the number, on the y-axis is the number of landscape unit biogeoclimatic combinations, and those are basically chunks of the land base. So there are 874 combinations in the Selkirk region. And along the bottom, you have categories of the percent old forest remaining. So in this first column here, it says that almost 350 of those combinations have less than 5% old forest remaining today. And as we cross across the chart, just a little over about 170 combinations have greater than 30% old forest remaining today. So summarizing that, 50%, half of the LU Beck combinations in the Selkirk region have less than 10% old forest remaining. And 80% of the LU Beck combinations have less than 30% old forest remaining. 30% old forest is considered the high risk threshold in the Great Bear Rainforest EBM strategy. So zooming out a little bit, you can still see Kootenai Lake at the bottom here. You can run up, you can see the East Kootenays. Purple is the old forest. Yellow is cut blocks. Suddenly the mountains stand out to those who are less familiar with them, and you can see, in quotes, the valley bottoms. Applying the Gawley-Merkel categories of areas that should be deferred, the areas where old and mature should be deferred from harvest are shown in the beige colors underneath. So I'll turn that back on just so that you can see it again. As you can see, well, I'll keep going. This, again, I don't know if people can see it well on your screen, but this is just highlighting Lake Creek at the north end of the Duncan. So old forest, I'll just put that back on so that you can see where you're looking again. Old forest, cut blocks. One of the things that stands out about Lake Creek is that it doesn't actually have cut blocks. It's pretty hard. You can search a long way on these, either on satellite image or on maps, to find valleys that do not have cut blocks actually in them yet. And that is one. This is how that base don't harvest here deferral layer overlays with that. So how many issues do we need for a place? So as Lake Creek is an example, we have old forest, we have intact forest, we very likely have ancient forest for which there's no mapping. We have caribou forest. I'm not sure how many of those sad caribou are left there. I think it's in the 20s now. When I first came to the Kootenays, it was a couple of hundred. Lake Creek was actually mapped as high value caribou habitat. It did not end up in the GAR order. We are shooting wolves in Lake Creek. 4 wolves were shot last year. Two escaped or intended to be shot this year. I was offered trail cam video of those wolves. Thank you. This whole thing is sad enough. I didn't want live pictures of the wolves that are going to be dead. But you can go online right now and comment on BCTS's harvesting plans that are slated for Lake Creek. So we have a system where we are good at doing some things and really poor at doing others. Solutions. The solutions are on some level really complicated. And, you know, these are some of the loopholes that have come up in my world in the last while. Less than 10% is very high risk. So you really notice when we looked at, I know I'm really annoying because I didn't give you a chance to really look at the maps, sorry. Less than 10% is very high risk. So we get this effect where in the places where we have high risk, we actually have very little forest left. One of the things that we negotiated way back when in the Great Bear Rainforest is that we should reserve 100% of the red listed forest types. So the forest that basically there's no old growth left anymore. And the problem of reserving 100% of the red listed forest types turned out to be that reserving 100% of nothing is still nothing. And that is actually how that intention was implemented and is still implemented. And that fight is going on today. So the details are complicated because they frankly get turned around and not implemented as intended. So we need really clear recruitment deferrals now. We don't need to just defer old growth. We need to make sure we are identifying appropriate recruitment in places where we have already logged the old growth. We actually need to manage for old growth today, not in 250 years. So, I mean, you would think this is relatively obvious, but we have a policy in BC that allows you to meet some of your old growth target by logging the stand today and waiting for it to regrow. And we're also in ongoing conversations today that do not necessarily prioritize the current stands. And that is a great concern to me. And then we get into the problem. So somebody identified less than 10% because it's the highest risk. But what about those systems with 11%? If you look carefully at my maps, you'll find that the ICH DW1 in the Kootenays has 15% left of old. So do we just continue with that? The wet types have way less than the natural amount of old, and they have very high fragmentation and very high values, but they don't easily fall into these categories. So if we don't deal with those well, we will fail in this task to revise old growth management. And then there's data issues, and this is a massive tangent, and it's an endless conversation. And unfortunately, I wonder if these guys knew that this was old forest. Could they tell? How about this and this? This is Truck Logger's first page today. They can tell. Do we think that they know whether that's old forest or not? So I fear that we get lost in the details, and while we do that, this is what happens. Going back to Gary and Al, the recommendation 2 is that we need a paradigm shift. So they said we need to start to manage for ecosystem health. I won't read this list to you. Their report is really good. I recommend going and looking at it if you haven't. We need a paradigm shift for how we do forest management. And frankly, from what I've seen, I'm very concerned that there is very little government will to take this on. But we will see. Somebody sent this to me just yesterday. This is BCTS telling someone in Europe that we have lots of old growth. Our practices are fine here. We're great. So we haven't changed as a province how we are marketing our forest management, even though we have an independent panel that has said we desperately need a paradigm shift, that this is not okay, what we are doing. And yet, as of February 2nd, 2021, this is what we are telling the world. So if we want a paradigm shift, we have to look at timber supply review. Timber supply review, for those who don't live in this world, is how the allowable annual cut is set. There are huge issues. I haven't found anybody who doesn't think there's an issue with how this process works. Again, this could be a couple of hours of talk, but basically we have the allowable cut effect that allows you to say that there's going to be more forest tomorrow, so let's log more of it today. Many downward pressures are ignored, while many upward pressures are embraced. The new productivity layer for British Columbia's forests gives you a 40% boost in future volume. If anybody wonders why the allowable cut in Fort Nelson TSA just went from 1.6 million to 2.5, it's basically because as we log that boreal forest, apparently it's going to come back with 40% more volume. So we need a chief scientist, not a chief forester. And we need a new letter. The chief forester is directed in their activities by a letter from the minister, and we need the letter to be revised. This really could be a long conversation, but basically what this graph shows is the current AAC in all of these TSAs in gray, and then on the right, the midterm harvest level. So as defined by the province, what we see here is a significant drop between the current level of harvest and what is available in the long term. And by definition, that means it's not sustainable. It has to go down. It's called the fall down. We embrace it. We have not managed for it. We are doing it. It's part of the old mantra for how forestry should be done. And if we want to embrace paradigm shift, we have to radically shift this process. So I just took a minute to look at some other data. This is from StatsCan, summaries of how much harvesting has happened by area and volume over the last, between 1990 and 2018. Interestingly, I found a little quote that said in 1980, the chief forester warned that unless forest management was intensified and utilization improved, the rate of harvest would decline. Well, the rate of harvest hasn't really declined. It's stayed pretty solidly at 71 million cubic meters per year over this whole time period. We have not had much success at all in increasing actual volumes. There was all kinds of FRBC work. We were going to fertilize, we were going to prune, we were going to do all this intensive work to change firstly, the job input, and secondly, the actual output from the forest. Instead, we created a new data layer that just does it all by itself. So harvesting has not declined over that period, but from the same data layer from StatsCan, the numbers of jobs associated with the forest industry, it's about 2% of BC's total jobs, has declined over that period quite significantly. And so the jobs per cubic meter, which is, these numbers here are extremely low from a global perspective. We get extremely little jobs from every tree that we cut in comparison to European countries. And that is, this is part of our problem. But the jobs per cubic meter has declined over the same period. So, tragedy, fairy tale, government has told us they're embarking on a new approach to old forests. This website started in 2020. The BC government is taking a new holistic approach. This will include protection of 9 areas throughout the province, totaling 353,000 hectares, in a break from divisive practices of the past, blah, blah. It took us less than a day to look at that announcement and conclude that of that 353,000 hectares, 25% of it is not even forest. 25% of it is young. Less than 1% of it is the high-risk old forest identified in the Gawley-Merkel report, 3,800 hectares. And what we just discovered recently, when you read the order in council, and I really had to read it about 10 times before I understood what it said, is actually only the old forest in the 353,000 hectares is deferred. So it's not protected, none of it's protected, and a tiny chunk of it is deferred. And most of it is not old, and most of it is not at risk. I noticed recently that the province just updated their website, deferring old forest harvesting in 9 areas. That's not what it said originally, but they haven't changed this protection of 9 areas piece. There's a good article on this in the Narwhal. As somebody said, a backward slide on an empty promise. I'm still looking for my fairy tale ending. So far, Karen, Dave, and I wrote an op-ed that graded the province with a D so far in terms of implementation of the new look at old forest. Now, at this point, I want to say that when I say the province, I mean this generic thing out there, the province. I do know that the province is full of a lot of well-meaning people who are really, really trying to do this work to the best of their ability and the best within the boxes that they are confined within. And we need that. And I want to say that I see that every day in my working world. But we need a significant change from the province. So what do we need to see in order to say there's some kind of fairy tale ending here? We need immediate deferrals of actual high risk old and mature. And that needs to include existing cut blocks, because what I'm hearing around the province is that people are getting just getting years worth of cut permits on old forest because they know that there is very little ability to take them back. This is a significant problem. We need to direct the statutory decision makers, both the chief forester and the district managers. They must be directed right now to prioritize ecosystem integrity and biodiversity. We could do that. The province could do that. They have not done that to date. More into play FERPA 2 changes that would repower our local district managers into actually being able to make decisions. Again, we have not seen this yet. It's supposedly coming, but we need it to shift into actually prioritizing these values. And then provincially, we need to focus on getting legislation that requires conservation and ecological integrity as overarching priorities. Everything right now says without unduly impacting timber supply, but it actually needs to say without unduly impacting ecological integrity. We need to overhaul timber supply review, both the process and the substance. We need funding for transition in the economic sector, and we need objectives for jobs, but not timber volume. We need to shift the whole emphasis of how we do this. And what I fear we are getting is a reorganization of ministries that'll take the next 2 years. And during that process, nothing will happen. We need action on these things, and there is no reason why we couldn't have this action sooner rather than later. when I first started working in BC, finishing my PhD in UBC, this was the state of play. This is what happened. And I frankly think that this is where we are going. If we don't see change coming, this is going to be the tragedy. This is what I am concerned is going to be in the future, unless we see concrete actions on these things. And I will stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. Great presentation. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and I'll just start working through them, Rachel. So the first one is, when does Rachel intend to stand for Chief Forester, or maybe Chief Scientist?
Great plan. Never.
Next
unless I will actually answer that question seriously. Unless we change our whole system. So recently I have talked to ex and current ministers, different kinds, and I am told that they cannot do anything unless it gets them votes. Literally, I am told that nobody can move. And so unless we have an actual overhaul in how the bureaucracy works, and that we get real accountability to these things that are common values, then I wouldn't take the job.
Okay, next question. How is old growth and ancient forest differently defined?
So old growth is tends to be used as a generic term that just means old forest, and we use it to kind of encapsulate that whole end of the range of natural systems. So in wet ecosystems, it's defined as, by the province, in the province as forests that are older than 250 years, and in the drier ecosystems as forests that are older than 140 years in age. Ancient forests are forests that have not been disturbed by natural disturbances, large-scale natural disturbances, for multiple generations of trees. So anybody who's lucky enough to have gone and stood in the remnant ancient forest in the Encomenflow, for instance, at the back of that valley, there are trees there that are 2,000, maybe 2,000 years old, certainly 1,000 years old, but the stand itself probably has not been disturbed since the last ice age. So you can see the remnants of multiple generations of massive trees that have fallen over and decayed, and so you get this incredible depth of ecological value. So ancient forests are ones that haven't been disturbed for multiple generations, and those systems have massive carbon value. Tangent talk.
Okay, great. Do you know where Klasnikov's new project, Syilx in Bloom, is located in relation to the old growth forest surrounding Nelson? Just looking briefly at the map you showed, it looks like their project is in very close proximity to the old growth near Nelson.
I don't believe their project overlaps with actual old forest, and I'm not familiar with the details of that project. So I will flag that it's always difficult when you go from strategic level data, which we have in the forest cover in the vegetation resources that I showed you, and then on the ground. So I don't believe their project overlaps with old forest. It does have some nice older forest close to it, but that's all I know.
Okay, and this person's concerned about climate change being used as a reason to harvest old growth. How should we be responding to comments from Government Forestry Office, such as there is no real reason to think that old growth is automatically more resistant to climate change related impacts? And should we be managing to historical reference points or trying to enhance mitigation through a coordinated stand replacement strategy?
All right, so I can remember the first question, a part of that. The idea that we should log forests for climate change is ridiculous. It's ludicrous. It is spin of the highest order. Forests that have stuck around over multiple generations of fires are more likely, they're in landscape positions for one, that are more likely to survive the next fires. So it's just frankly illogical. Secondly, the main issue around climate is the fact that we must do climate mitigation. That is beyond all other things that we humans should be doing. We should be doing everything through a climate mitigation lens. And forests that have large amounts of carbon, both in the trees and in the soil, should be left standing up, because we cannot afford, I took out my climate slides because I didn't have time to talk about them, but we cannot afford any time. So there's this ludicrous argument that we could log the forests and then the little trees will grow back and sequester carbon. Well, we have carbon. It is sequestered. It's called large old forests, and all large not old forests, frankly. It is already there. It is sequestered. Leave it there. We cannot afford to be releasing it to the atmosphere. From an adaptation perspective, if you log the forest, climate change hits the ground right that second. So we already know that this is runaway, that our ecosystems do not have the ability to adapt to climate change, but we can add in some time resilience by leaving mature forests standing. Again, walk on a hot day, walk into a closed canopy older forest, and the temperature is 5 degrees lower. Like, we need that to keep the water cool. We need that to keep the fish living. I'll stop.
Well, that was a great answer. The other part of this person's question was about the historical reference points and how to think about that in terms of stand replacement strategy and climate change. If you have any more thoughts on that.
Right. I'm not quite sure what the question really means, but, maybe, history is history. Our ecosystems have evolved through the historical past. And it is true that our climates are changing radically now at a rate unprecedented. But the thing that we know is how they have been. And frankly, for most of our ecosystems, we've moved so far away from the natural level, and we are seeing the impacts. We are losing species, and water is warming, and all of those things. So I'm not quite sure where that question is going. I think that the historical level is a very useful threshold to understand the risks and the pressures that we're putting ecosystems under today.
Okay, great. So the next question, how do we get more deferrals in areas we know that need them?
Good question. Maybe I should look up the district manager's number. I think I ended on this slide because I spend my days, and lots of you do, delving in the details, drowning in the details, literally drowning in the details. It's people who will make this change. And frankly, if you care about this issue, you need to tell people, internal or external to government, whatever your job, humans have, like we, the people, we have to start to voice our concerns. It's been an interesting social shift over the last 25 years. When I first moved to the Kootenays, my first job was flying every landscape unit to set out old growth management areas, most of which do not exist today. And at that time, people cared about the forest. They were vocal. There was a lot of action about the land. And for good reason, that concern has shifted into climate concern, but kind of existential climate concern. if we care about the land, we need to start to say so again. And that's, I think people need to voice that.
Okay. Hey, do you have any comments for professional foresters and how they might navigate this issue in the context of new professional reliance? And second part of it is, do you see any role for professional reliance in the mix of solutions?
I had slides in here that talked about the Dark Ages years. I took them out. The professional governance piece it's very interesting. So, again, I deal with a lot of people who care about a lot of things and often are prevented from doing the right thing or forced to put a cut block in a place, and then the cut block gets as good as it can be, but the bottom line is it shouldn't be there. There is a limit, irrespective of how well that system has worked. There is a limit to what individual people can do. You have to have strategic leadership in order to set the whole bounds. If the harvest level, if the cut level is too high, there is nothing that individuals can do really to solve the problem. So, first of all, I say strategically, the province needs to take back control of the Crown land and set goals for it that are appropriate with society demands. And those would be to maintain ecological values and to provide jobs. And currently we do neither. We just set goals for volume and we make money for some people. So at that level, that is the big picture. Within that, I think the Professional Governance Act, I think it's going to be interesting. I could write a list of complaints that I would make against making poor decisions at this point. I think there is a place for professional responsibility and accountability. It has thoroughly failed. We have report after report after report about its failure. And it's very unfair to put people in that position when they're actually not given an ability to respond. I think it will be interesting to see what happens in a year from now if the government has done nothing, whether we see a rash of complaints against all the professionals who are not doing what we've committed to do and what we know needs to be done.
Okay, and so one person's wondering, does this need to be laid at the feet of the Premier?
This is at the feet of the Premier. It's exactly, that's where it needs to come from. The leadership needs to come from the very top, from the Prime Minister's office, and that group of people that they're the gatekeeper for what happens here.
Okay, and it seems though that the province is a dead end to making immediate change. What can be done to stop old growth logging without the province on board?
It's kind of interesting because I was thinking about this morning and I said to my son, maybe I could do my Trump impression right on the talk. Like, is this inciting? Like, this is what it's going to take if we don't see action. I don't want to be impeached, though. It was kind of a joke. It's up to people, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't have an answer other than that. We have to hope. I mean, the government committed to implementing all 14 recommendations of the panel report. So far, they have utterly failed. And I am at a loss to understand why they did what they did, because it was worse than doing nothing, frankly. It really was worse than doing nothing. I have spent much of my spare time over the COVID years because I didn't have any work. So you just do all this stuff for fun because it's interesting. And being hopeful about this change that is coming, being hopeful for the FERPA 2 changes, being hopeful that we're going to re-empower the Crown to manage the Crown land. I haven't seen anything yet. I also watched, the Minister of Forests who started the panel retire. And I'm not going to comment about why he would have done that, but Doug Donaldson stepped down. Now we are rearranging the deck chairs within the ministry. And I don't know. I'm all into romance and fairy tale endings. So let's just go with that. Let's hope that they do something.
Okay. Well, you have a comment here. Someone admiring how brave and passionate you are, and thanking you for all your volunteer time in getting to the bottom of this. So I'm sure everyone feels the same, but thank you, Amy Waterhouse, for putting that here. So another question, how can data from private land be included?
Well, there certainly are, forests of great concern because private land tends to be in the valley bottoms everywhere. It's an issue, and because, as we know here in Nelson, there's basically no restraints at all about the kind of harvesting that you can do on private land. That is an issue for sure, and private land organizations that try and do something about, there tends to be very little old forest remaining in private land in much of the province, but where it is there, it's of extremely high value. So that is a key thing that people, that those groups I know are working on.
Okay, next question is, are we not better to define old growth by structural complexity rather than age?
Yes. Does anybody have a data set? Yes, absolutely. It would be way better. We know that there are failures. So this is the thing. We can get lost in, and we do. We are lost. Like, don't. I only said that for a few people on the call who I know are here, that I'm lost with, wandering around lost. We are trying to solve these problems using the best available data. And the best available data is not good enough. And it's kind of why I showed tongue-in-cheek the pictures of the trucks with the big trees on them. Somebody knows where they are. Somebody stands at the bottom of them and lays out a cut block or puts a road in. We at that level, we know where these high value stands are. But we don't have a system that identifies them very well at the strategic scale in order to protect them. And it is a significant problem. So yes, I would like there to be a better inventory of stand structure, but we don't have it, and we don't have time to get it. So the VRI site index example, which is highly correlated with volume and for technical reasons has other good things about it, actually is from a mapped data layer that people spent a lot of time reflecting the natural variability out of there. And it's not bad as a place to start. And we do need to, we actually need the data layers that people use to harvest. They use LiDAR. They can highlight where those big trees are, and they go in and they get them out. That's what they do. The rest of us don't have access to that data, and that is a problem. So we need to bring in measures to defer harvest of all of these. Maybe we should have a DBH limit. No trees greater than X size get harvested at all until we've sorted this out, because unfortunately, we lose forests so quickly that that we just can't wait for another data layer. I'm tempted. I'm just gonna, anyway, that's good.
Okay, we're beyond the 11 o'clock mark here, so I understand some folks probably need to leave this webinar, but Rachel said she's willing to stick on for another 15 or so minutes. We have quite a few questions lined up, but I just want to let folks know we really appreciate you joining us today, and expect a follow-up email from KCP with a link to this recorded webinar, a survey, and other things, that materials that we might be able to include for you all. So on to our next question here. So someone's concerned about logging ancient forest in the MH zone. Last significant stands of old growth in most of our district. Nothing in our area classified above 340 years in VRI, but tree ring counts showing trees are 800 to 1200 years old in recent harvested stands. How do we deal with limitations in the provincial database?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I mean, I think I go back to the answer that I gave a minute ago, which is that we know that these limitations are there. You know, I don't know how long ago it was. Andy McKinnon and Laurie Kremsader and I and other people recommended that we split up the data and try and create a better data set for those really old forests. But I will go back and say, somebody stood at the bottom of those trees, and if they'd thought about it, which they probably did, because most people can't walk into these amazing forests without feeling some kind of amazement. If they had thought about it, they would have gone, oh, I bet this stand is not 100 years old. This stand is not 200 years old. Look at the ground, look at the humps, look at the complexity. Oh, I wonder how old it is. And then they didn't think beyond that, and then we logged it. So that is the process that happens on the ground. We may well have to initiate direction, and that's what, you know, I just flipped off my last slide. I'm sorry, I don't know how that happened, but you know, that thing about empowering the district managers and the chief foresters to set direction, we could simply say, you can't log that stuff. So you log the first tree, and if you find that there are trees in these stands, or you call the trees in advance, we may have to go there because we don't have the data and we are being constantly undermined. But somebody knew. That's all I can say, that the trees were old.
Okay, and then a couple of comments about the new minister, Katrine Conroy, being local and wondering if she knows the issues and if she's qualified to be the new minister. In your opinion?
Yes. Well, I don't believe there's a requirement to be qualified from a ministerial perspective, and that's fair enough. That's how it works. That's what politics is. I was slated to have a call with her last Friday. Unfortunately, it was cancelled by the office in advance because she didn't want to. She wasn't allowed to talk about ministerial subject matter. She was allowed to talk about local issues, but not talk about forests with me. So hopefully that meeting gets rescheduled. Our local MLA here in Nelson, Brittany Anderson, has been very open to hearing about these issues, and I have given her a very short version of the talk that I just gave here. Hopefully, Katrine Conroy and Nathan Cullen are both. It's a little unclear. I believe Nathan is going to be in charge of the old growth portfolio, but not sure. But they're limited by the bureaucrats, frankly. And yes, the ability of Katrine Conroy and Nathan Cullen to do something will be directed by Hogan's office.
Okay. So is your work in line for peer review publication? And if so, when might we see it, and where would it be published?
It is accepted with the Canadian Journal of Forest Research, and I don't have a date of when it will be out, but as soon as it is out, it is. So it's in press now, and it will be available shortly. Okay.
And do you see gains for old growth biodiversity by focusing on land use plans and better OGMAs?
Well, sure. So in the process, I mean, OGMAs are just a name for the area that you're not going to log, but supposedly got old in it. I know that there's very good work happening to try and improve the process for determining what's in your OGMR and where they are. We have to remove the limitations that currently exist, though, because the current rules say that you have to put your OGMRs, or that you can put your OGMRs in areas that don't have old forest and that aren't representative. And so we have to change that whole piece if we want those to be effective. I certainly am uninterested in engaging in a yet another deck chair moving process there. And certainly, so if we had a change in direction set by this paradigm shift notion, then absolutely land use planning and an identification of areas off limits to harvesting would be part of the strategy. Of course, there remain these loopholes. So you can move your OGMRs right now. So you can swap them for some other area. And we've engaged locally on, frankly, egregious occasions where old forest or older forest was swapped, and we ended up with electricity pipeline right of way in an OGMR instead of forest. You know, those kind of things have happened. Hopefully they are happening less, but it's part of what happens when you move to an entire unmanaged, unwatched professional reliance system.
And what's the present status of Ktunaxa Provincial Park, where old growth spruce are? Any logging plan there, do you know?
I don't know. So again, we have a problem. 20 years ago, I could tell you where logging was planned. We had forest development plans. I have tried to get the data on, there are digital data layers that give you some level of proposed blocks, but it is not consistent and not helpful and not far enough in advance. Again, a year or more ago, the provincial government promised to change that element of the Forest and Range Practices Act. And I believe it is coming into play that now you actually, as a licensee, have to develop basically a forest operations schedule and put proposed blocks on a map that are publicly available again. So I understand that that is now in play again. And so soon you'll be able to know, at least, hopefully that is comprehensive, digital, freely available, and actually real. I know they modeled it on the Fort St. John pilot legislation, which also has huge issues. But if we move back to a situation where we actually get cut block maps, that would be very helpful.
Where do you consider that most of the political pressure to not change forestry practices is coming from?
I don't know. Your imagination's as good as mine. Yeah, there are people who are actively working to, you know, they're just, you can see in the world the people who have been standing up in front of crowds. I've heard the talks. Archie McDonald, for example, head of Kofi, gave a talk that I was at, I don't know, last time I was in a group in a group setting in a conference. Imagine that. You know, bemoaning the state of the timber supply and wondering how we got there. We have managed ourselves into this situation very purposely, and there are those clinging to that. And I think they're fairly obvious who they are, so I'm not going to name them. But, you know, it is in some people's interest to maintain the status quo, but it is not, frankly, in most people's interest to maintain the status quo. And that is what we need to start to embrace.
Yeah. Okay. So there's interest here. What data do we have on remaining old growth on private, not crown lands?
I don't know the answer. I'm sorry. There is pretty poor mapping that is available through the province that does cover private land and forest types, but it's not accurate and it's not updated very often. I can't think what it's called offhand, but it's not very good. So maybe if somebody else on this call knows a better answer to that. I don't understand that there is a good layer. Maybe if somebody knows, they can answer it in the chat.
Okay, and are the old growth patches of Give Out Creek immediately threatened?
Well, they're not protected.
Okay.
So that, I mean, what I mean by that silence is if anything that is not, so let's be really clear about this. The intention is to log all the forest unless it's in a park, or if it's in an OGMA, which can still be logged, but you have to move the OGMA to somewhere else. And there are other designations that prevent the forest from being harvested, but within many of them, you can still harvest. So limited protection under different ungulate winter ranges or wildlife habitat areas. We have wildlife habitat features regulations, which apparently have no impact on timber supply. There is all these designations of things, most of which don't actually prevent the forest from being harvested. So any forest that's not in a park or is not under one of these strict regulations is going to be harvested. So I would say the old growth forest out Give Out Creek is absolutely at imminent risk because it can be harvested tomorrow. It would take slightly longer than that to get the permits, but the permits have to be given by the district manager because they are not allowed to not give them. And so yes, every bit of forest that is out there is to be harvested, and it has to be because we've already calculated that it will be in the TSR process. There's no give in that process. So if we don't, I would suggest that the bikers at Give Out Creek will probably manage to protect that little bit. The Eco Society spent quite a bit of time trying to engage with ATCO with some rare hemlock stands, old forest stands behind the obvious stand on Power Slave, and got some of it protected and other of it not protected. It was completely rare old forest, but there was nothing that we could do about it. And you know, so if we by default socially protect some area like that particular stand, then the cut is even more unsustainable because then you have to log somewhere else harder to meet the cut level. So we really do, that's where land use planning comes in. We need to step back and incorporate real protection and then reflect it immediately in the TSR, and not have these ridiculous processes where you get 10 years grace in your TSR before you reflect anything that you're going to do. So yes, it's at risk.
Okay, couple more questions here, Rachel. Thanks for hanging in. You're giving some really good answers. So next one is how to manage the BEC land use units, which have lower than 10% old growth back to healthy level over time.
Right. So first of all, we have to stop harvesting immediately in those areas so that there is a moment to breathe so that we can plan. Then we need to identify the actual old forest that remains in those areas. And then we have to build upon those areas and add mature forest, some older mature, of which there is, older mature forest in these types, and build areas that are large enough, that have interior forest habitat, that are large enough to be functional over time. And we need to draw lines around them on a map and actually protect them. We need to think about landscape level considerations and join them up. And, you know, it literally was my first job that I did. I spent a year or more working with Stuart Clow out of the ministry office. And we flew these landscape units. You can do it in a day and identify, you can see the best forest. And yes, there would probably need to be some ground truthing on some of it, but it would not be hard. And people are working on, I mean, we know how to do this. We just haven't been given, we politically, we haven't been given the go ahead to actually do it. But there are lots of really good people locally in the ministry who know exactly how to do this process.
Okay, next question. Would biodiversity assessments, numbers, data analysis for old growth forests help speed up decisions in favor of immediate deferrals?
I think you might have to say that again. I didn't understand what the question was.
Okay, would biodiversity assessments that included analysis and data for old growth forests help to speed up decisions in favor of immediate deferrals?
I think we're done with data. I think we just need to do the deferrals part. I'm not sure if I'm missing the question. I mean, I think we know where we're at. You know, there's always complexity in the data pieces. And I really don't want us to lose the trees for the complexity of the data, which is what's currently happening. So yeah, I think we need to jump right away to not harvesting, deferring harvest on all those greater than 20 site index stands as a very minimum of data use, and it has its issues. But the bottom line is we know those stands are rare, irrespective of other issues. And I suspect, you know, there is complexity. So for instance, in the wet ICH zones, there is very high value old forests remaining there that are that there isn't good data for in terms of where the best areas are. And current work is trying to look at whether other volume estimates or other data can be used to identify the best areas. So there is some work to be done, but what we shouldn't be doing is giving out cutting permits or allowing harvesting in places that might be in that category right now. We can be precautionary. It's that thing, you can save it, and we have to save it again and again and again. But you get to log it only once. And, you know, really, wouldn't it be, it's that joke about, oh, shame, we discovered that we saved the earth by accident.
So what about holding the federal government accountable for enacting emergency orders with respect to caribou, spotted owl, to help drive this home a bit?
Yeah. Yes, well, they've not been terribly good at that, have they? I can't say that I hold out much hope that their federal government is going to enact emergency orders for anything bigger than a frog, which is what they've done so far. You know, again, we ended up in a situation there with loopholes in the legislation, don't allow you to identify critical habitat. If we change the paradigm, so I mean, what happens right now is a bunch of people who care about something show up and try and argue for an intent, and then, oh, like, let's protect the rare old forest, or let's protect caribou habitat. And then people run away for years and do all this complicated stuff. And when you come back, you don't have, you know, we don't protect the habitat of endangered species in the endangered species legislation. You're like, really, how is that possible? If we had a paradigm shift and the people who actually cared about the caribou habitat were allowed to be the people who ended up in power, because that's not what happens, and that's a very interesting social social question, we wouldn't have that ridiculousness. It's the same way that, you know, we're allowed to protect the tiniest little bit of the red listed ecosystem, but there isn't any, and no, you can't have any recruitment because we didn't write that down. You know, we are playing this ludicrous game, and if we had a paradigm shift, in theory, the onus would be on the other foot for how we make decisions, and we wouldn't be in this mess. But right now, there is not an effective, there are very few effective tools.
Yeah, and given this, I'll give you the last question. Someone's wondering, do we need to start Ktunaxa 2? Ktunaxa Sound 2.
Don't want to be impeached.
Yeah, I mean, someone chimed in here and said the science is, you know, being ignored, and there's so much failing right now. Really, what is there to do strategically, tactically?
Well, so we have a voice. You have to use your voice. If you don't use your voice, then you don't have a voice. People who care need to tell people at all levels that they care. The district manager here has known about these issues for many years. We have talked to, I don't know, 4, possibly 5 different district managers about this subject over the last 10 plus years. Nobody has done anything at all, and we've made minor headways on this issue. But, you know, if there were 50 of us instead of 5 of us, that would be helpful. If they knew that people cared, that would be helpful. If Hagen really knew, I mean, he's got a full mandate now. He can do whatever he likes pretty safely in the next short while before thinking again about being reelected. If at the time of Ktunaxa we'd actually done the things that FRBC were intended to do, which was transition the industry, we wouldn't be in this mess now. But nobody grasped it then. And so it's even harder now. People need to know that people care.
Yeah. And thank you, Rachel, so much for your caring and all the work that you're doing with Karen and Dave and others. I know that, you know, this is a super important conversation for all of us. It's now about 11:30. I think you've done an awesome job fielding all these questions. There are some remaining, and they're more technical in nature. So if you want to get in touch with Rachel, our follow-up email will have her contact information. And I just want to remind everybody that next week, February 17th, is our next webinar, Creston Valley Green Mapping with Brian Churchill. And there'll be a registration link in our follow-up email to you, as well as a link to Rachel's report and a survey. So I want to thank you again for
Marcy.
Yes?
Can I just say that I work with this, I sit mostly in my house by myself with my dog and my chickens, but I work with an incredible team of people. So Karen and Dave wrote the report with me, but many other people locally do a huge amount of work on this, and I'm not going to name them, but I just want to say that, you know, I'm the voice of this today, but this is work that a small but really dedicated bunch of people work on a lot. Thanks to those people.
Great. Yeah, we're in a great region. There's a lot of great thinkers here. So thanks again, everyone, for attending this webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day.